Hey there. Today on the podcast, I talk with former Disney Imagineer Bob Baranick about his work on Frontierland at Disneyland Paris, Indiana Jones and Tarzan's Treehouse at Disneyland, the Land Pavilion in Epcot, and his attempts to build a theme park in North Carolina. You're listening to the Tomorrow Society podcast. Thanks for joining me here on episode 71 of the Tomorrow Society podcast. I am your host, Dan Heaton. One of my favorite projects to learn more about is the creation of Disneyland Paris. The development really took hold in the late 1980s, and you had so many talented young Imagineers that were really starting to take over the company and make a difference in how Disney made its attractions and parks. And these were people like Tony Baxter and Tom Morris and Eddie Sato and Tim Delaney, Greg Meter, who was a guest on this show a few months back, and the guest of this episode, Bob Baranick, who joined Disney in the mid-'80s and pretty quickly got involved with working on Frontierland at Disneyland Paris. That area is so interesting to me, especially because of Phantom Manor, which is a really cool take on the Haunted Mansion. And what surprised me was learning that it was actually a pretty big challenge to get Phantom Manor in there at Disneyland Paris. And Bob also worked on so many other cool projects, including the refresh of Epcot in the early 90s with Rolly Crump, the long saga to have the Indiana Jones adventure built at Disneyland, plus Tarzan's Treehouse, the changeover from the Swiss Family Treehouse at Disneyland. And Bob also worked on some other projects outside of Disney, like the Six Flags Power Plant in Baltimore, which is a very odd project that didn't last for too long, and his project Whirligig Woods, which was Bob's attempt to build a boutique theme park in North Carolina that unfortunately didn't come to pass. Before I get to my conversations with Bob, I wanted to say thanks to the new members of the Tomorrow Society: Brett, Clay, Christopher, Matt, Todd, and Tyler. This show is a listener-supported show, so a small pledge of $1 or $2 an episode makes a huge difference and also gets some very cool perks along the way. You can learn more at patreon.com/Tomorrow Society. Well, I really enjoyed talking to Bob. He had a lot of fun stories about many classic attractions that I love. So it was really fun to learn a bit more about these attractions. Here is Bob Baranick.
I probably had more school than most of my friends did because there was no such thing as a theme park designer when I was in college. And I had 4 or 5 majors and minors just because I had studied what the original Imagineers had done. And I put together a background of art and theater and architecture and all kinds of fun things.
When you were younger, it sounds like you were a fan of Imagineering and Disneyland. Was that something really early on that you wanted to do and get involved in as a career?
It sure was. As far back as I can remember, my family used to tease me about it, but they were really good, and they would take me to Disneyland all the time. The big turning point for me was when Disney put out the book about Pirates of the Caribbean, the making of Pirates of the Caribbean, and showed all these old guys with white shirts and thin black ties, and they were building models and artwork. And, it was Mark Davis and Herbie Ryman, Claude Coates, all these wonderful designers, and I just knew exactly what I wanted to do for my career, and I dedicated myself to that, even all the way through high school.
So how did you end up getting started working for Disney after you had done all that preparation, but how did it work out?
Well, like a lot of designers, I tried to get in the door maybe 3 or 4 times. The closest opportunity I had was, unfortunately, right after 5,000 people had finished building Epcot. And they were really intrigued with my portfolio and the skills I had, but they were letting people go because this major project had just finished. And I remember this one week where I was from the Bay Area, and San Francisco Bay Area, and I came down to LA and had all these interviews all over town. And the manager of the model shop, Mike Morris at the time, said, "You ought to go talk to this Gary Goddard guy." And I had never heard of Gary, so I just took my portfolio over to Gary's office that afternoon, and I was hired on the spot. And so I worked for Gary Goddard for a few years until Disney geared back up to do Disneyland Paris. And I was one of the first people they hired for that, with Eddie Sato, who also worked at Gary Goddard's at the time. So it was kind of a natural thing. It just took a long time, like so many Imagineers have to go through. A very, very typical story.
I can imagine that once you got there, especially with Disneyland Paris and the late 80s, early 90s with Michael Eisner and Frank Wells and all of that, was such an exciting time.
It was a renaissance. We were thrilled. We knew it at the time. We knew that as we were doing it, these were the good old days. So we enjoyed every bit of it. When I walked in the door, they had 5 projects they were getting off the ground. One was Splash Mountain for Disneyland. One was Pleasure Island. One was Typhoon Lagoon. One was the Studio Tour. And the other, I can't remember what the 5th project was, but everybody in WDI was working on those. And so I was assigned to Splash Mountain because of my whimsical style. The real intention at WDI was to put me on Disneyland Paris, which they were waiting for all the T's to get crossed and the I's to get dotted in the contracts with France. And as soon as it happened, we were up and running.
So Splash Mountain, I love that attraction. It's still one of my favorites. What did you end up doing on Splash before you went to Paris?
I was on the model. I got to work primarily on the finale, and this is the Disneyland Splash Mountain. So I was working with John Stone and Tony Baxter and Bruce Gordon. Jeff Burke was the producer of Frontierland for Disneyland Paris, and he asked me to be his model builder for Frontierland. And my background is the Old West. I came from Frontier Village in San Jose, and so I loved the old Western TV shows. And France was really in love with that style. They loved the Southwest, and they loved the Marlboro Man and Bonanza and all that stuff. So Frontierland was a hit from the get-go. We had to fight and battle to get some of the attractions, like Phantom Manor. We always knew it was going to be a Western, but the problem was the overall budget of the park and how many e-tickets they could have. And they knew they weren't building Jungle Cruise, but we had to lobby pretty hard. And I think because we did such a nice job with Phantom Manor, we had beautiful models and a lot of artwork and stuff. I think Michael and Frank were very impressed with it and decided to put it into the program for opening day.
That's crazy to think about, because I went to Paris in 2006, and Phantom Manor is an incredible attraction. I love that Frontierland, especially with Big Thunder out on the island, and you go out to it. It's so unique even compared to the other parks. But it really interests me to think of Phantom Manor as not being just the shoe-in. It's like the one you had to fight for. It's interesting to me. Why do you think there was such hesitation to do that?
It was money. We really had the confidence that we were going to get to build it. So it was integral to the whole storyline of Frontierland, Thunder Mesa, and the characters and the time period, and all of it worked together as one place. The design team really believed in it and thought we were always going to get to do it, but we did have to sell it. I mean, we had to convince corporate that it needed to be in the opening day program. But some other things fell out, like Space Mountain had to back off a little bit. Pirates, oddly enough, was another one that the guys had to really lobby hard for, because the park was going to be much smaller than it actually ended up being on opening day. And then, ironically, they ended what they call an added capacity program, I think within the next year or 2 years later, where they added a lot of walkthroughs and different attractions, secondary attractions throughout the park.
That's interesting because that whole side of the park, Pirates and Phantom Manor and Big Thunder, but those two especially, I feel like anchor the park on that side so well. It's hard to think of them not being there. In terms of Phantom Manor, I know that obviously has more of an Old West theme from the Haunted Mansion. What was it like, with Jeff Burke and others kind of working on the different thing? Yeah.
I had so much fun because Jeff was able to go see Phantom of the Opera when it opened in London. And so he was really into the storyline and that whole mood of it. And I was kind of bringing in the Western elements. I brought to project a lot of the Mark Davis stuff from Western River Expedition and, just the things that ended up being the mythology of the land. And it fits so well together, when you talk about how it fits with Big Thunder Mountain and the town of Thunder Mesa. Pat Burke, who was the prop designer for the entire land, and I think Adventureland as well, really created a lot of that backstory because he was so involved with Big Thunder. I think he and Skip had worked on every Big Thunder that they had built. So the team was really close-knit and really believed and had a lot of passion in our project. We thought Frontierland was really, really strong.
Yeah, it anchors the park even more than I think in some of the other castle parks. I mean, along with the Adventureland area over there, because it's just, it's so strong. And you can feel, I love the connections. And I know a lot of fans who, know the story of the Western River Expedition and stuff, love the connections there because it's one of those what ifs about what we could have had in Florida. So it's great to see something that at least makes some nods to such an amazing idea.
And one of the other fun things that the guys were able to do was the juxtaposition of putting Adventure Island with the pirate ship, Pirates of the Caribbean, and the transition into Fantasyland with Peter Pan right there. So you had all these pirate elements next to each other. And the park kind of had that whole flow to it, very, very much all the way around the perimeter of the park. Things just worked really well. One of the other fun things about Disneyland Paris were the arcades that Eddie Sato worked on, which were the back access behind Main Street. And, that was a requirement for covered queue and the weather condition, but he turned it into quite a show. And it also was a wonderful transition from Main Street to Discoveryland, and from Main Street to Frontierland.
Yeah, I remember we were there and it rained a lot when we were there. And we walked down that back corridor behind Main Street there that you mentioned. And I was like, this is incredible. We could have easily been here and not even seen it. So it's interesting too how many Imagineers at the time that were fairly young like yourself and Tony Baxter and Tom Morris and Eddie Sato, who now are kind of these legends that are imparting their stories today. I mean, what was it like that time to be among that group in Paris?
Well, we really respected each other. Everybody enjoyed being together, socially and at work. We had a few guys, mostly in the architectural group and some ride engineering groups, that were veterans from way back. And they were kind of the sages, but we were kind of considered a young group to have a major responsibility like that. But everybody was so passionate, not only with their skills, but with the properties that they were working with. Tom Morris in particular with his castle. He had quite a challenge because how do you go to Europe and build a castle when Europe is castles? But he created something that's very whimsical and very beautiful and stands on its own.
Yeah, I love the castle. It's so striking. And yet, like you mentioned, it's across the board, the challenges to make a park in Europe, because there was a lot of hesitation among, just overall PR about the park for it to end up coming out so great. And I know it had struggles financially, but the park itself, the quality up front was just incredible.
Well, the rumor is, at least our understanding of it, was that the hotels were overbuilt. I guess Michael Eisner could explain that better than anybody because he wanted to work with big name architects. And I don't know who put together the program of how many hotels and how many rooms they needed. But I think that was the financial challenge when the park opened. The park was a thing of beauty and people loved it. Unfortunately, for years, it wasn't kept up. But I understand in the last 5 years or better, maybe 10 years, they've gone back and really put some serious maintenance into it. I'm anxious to see what Phantom Manor is going to be when it opens. And I think it's within the month, actually.
Yeah, it's really soon. I know I've seen that weird picture of like the scrim over the Phantom Manor because it's still being redone. But it's great to see because that park deserves that kind of attention. And I know they had financial constraints, but it sounds like too, they're going to make a lot of additions to the other park there and hopefully, which needed a ton, but hopefully make it better.
And they're great properties. They're relevant properties that people really are going to be drawn to.
For sure. Well, I want to transition a bit back here to the States because I know I mentioned Tony Baxter earlier, and I know one of the attractions you worked on is Indiana Jones Adventure in California.
Right.
Because that's a great attraction, especially for people like myself who've more been to Florida, and then we go out there and say, oh my gosh, sitting out there in Adventureland. What was it like to work on that attraction?
Well, it was a long history. It was probably my toughest battle in the company because I was working on that in the evenings while I was working on Disneyland Paris during the day. And the reason for that is because Disney had this contract with George Lucas. They were doing Star Tours, and they had signed to use the Indiana Jones property, and they had to use it or lose it by a certain date. And I believe that date was 1996, sorry. But they weren't really dealing with it. They'd kind of put it on the back shelf. And so what I was doing was building models and doing drawings of what some have seen as the Lost Expedition. It's the grand scheme for Adventureland that included what is currently the Indiana Jones Jeep ride. And it also had the mine car ride, and it had Jungle Cruise reroute. And it was a big grand scheme. And I was trying to make the whole project really exciting for corporate to go ahead and get the project funded. And it took, my goodness, 5-6 years of that process on the side, not being funded, of just getting the company excited about it, even though they had this contract to use the IP of Indiana Jones. There had been a separate development with the R&D group. John Snoddy was leading that, who was developing the ride system. And that's the system that's there in the park today. It's also the dinosaur ride system in Animal Kingdom. They put us together. And so we were doing story and theme overlays to his ride system. And we did 3 different generations of mock-ups and brought Michael and Frank in and showed them. And they got excited. And then all of a sudden they changed their mind. And at one point, Michael said, well, we just opened this stunt show in the studio tour in Florida. Why don't we just put that in? And so we had to work on that for about a year. And it was kind of interesting because I think at that time, George was kind of getting frustrated. George Lucas was getting frustrated because he wanted the mine car ride so bad. I mean, he had put it in the movie, and he had always described this as a ride system where the guests could actually use the brake. And, we had developed some mock-ups and had some fun things where it was jumping a broken track and there were sparks on the rails, and it was really exciting. The company was not going to pursue the mine car because of the capacity. So anyway, we were working on this stunt show, and George was going along with it, but he really wanted the ride. And we had developed storylines about young Indiana Jones and how it might fit Frontierland, where they're building Star Wars today, and went through all this process. The team was like, we weren't quite 100% into it. We were doing it because we were asked to do it, but we all really wanted the ride. And finally, at one point in, I guess it was 1991 or thereabouts, where Michael said, oh, heck, you know what? We should just do the ride. and we got it funded. And that was a huge victory. So I was put in charge of a team, and we had about 40 or 50 people that developed and at the time we were still trying to push for the mine car ride. We had a walk-through labyrinth, and it was kind of involved a fun experience because very much like what I believe Rise of the Resistance is, where you get on a ride, you get stuck, you get off the ride, you have to find your way out and through this thing. And there's a whole series of events that would have been about a 30-minute overall attraction experience. Well, it all got broken down to just the ride that was built and opened in 1995, which is great, but that's still a victory. After all that time. That's 9 years of developing that.
It's so interesting because I look at the ride that's there and I think that's really epic. Look at what they did. It's so ambitious with the queue and the whole experience. It feels like a complete experience. And then I've heard before about this, but the whole idea that you would have had multiple attractions, the minecart thing. I know they have the coaster that the coaster in Paris and Japan. Yeah, the Temple of Peril and such, which does kind of use that, but not in the same way. It's still a neat attraction. It's interesting how much more it could have been, and I'm glad you were able to do it.
There was one point where I was able to get Brian Jowers, who is just a wonderful illustrator, and he was on Indy with me for several years, just creating one beautiful rendering after another of all these different environments. And when he did the one that we all call the kitchen sink, which is the interior that shows the cavern on fire with the train and the Jungle Cruise and the mine car and the Jeep ride, we thought that was really going to sell it. And in fact, it had just the opposite reaction. It was like, oh, this is ridiculous. We can't do this. Let's just shut this down. And they ended up kind of working with different programming numbers, capacities, and budgets and so forth, and ended up with the attraction that they built. The guests love, right?
Totally. Yeah, I love it. It's a hit. It's been a hit for 20 plus years, and it worked out. It's interesting you mentioned capacity, though, because I think of Rise of the Resistance that you mentioned and how the scale and ambition and all these new attractions we're seeing from Universal and Disney with this huge scale, but a lot of them have low capacities. It's almost like back then, even though they pulled back on some of the fun stuff you could have done, they somehow avoided what now could happen in Star Wars with these just massive waits.
Well, when I was working with Indy, I had a number of 2,400 an hour, which is just about what the Jeep ride is. And I was really lobbying hard for the mine car ride. And so what we developed as a creative team was this situation where you rode the Jeep and got stuck in the temple. Everybody had to walk through this labyrinth, which is like Escher kind of, with different levels and fun mazes and stuff. And basically, it was a way to weed out the capacity to feed the mine car so that 2/3 of the people getting off the Jeep were successful in escaping the temple. 1/3 got stuck and had to ride the mine car out. And because we could change the walls and move all kinds of different paths and stuff, you really never knew which path you were going to get. So it was kind of an encouragement to go back and ride it again if you, in fact, wanted to get on the mine car. And take another chance and get stuck to ride the mine car as the escape.
Wow. That's crazy.
Yeah, it would have been fun. And I'm really happy to hear what they're trying in Star Wars because, that's a great idea that, and all great ideas never really die. They get morphed into something else.
Yeah, that's totally a common theme I always hear about Disney and Imagineering will pull up something from that you or someone else worked on from 20, 30 years ago, and then all of a sudden it's a new thing.
Well, and that's what we did with Mark Davis's Western River by putting it into the finale of Phantom Manor. In a small way, it's a tribute to Mark and his brilliant idea.
And it's great to see fans notice that, especially people that are really into the parks. They really appreciate moves like that. So I also wanted to mention, you mentioned Pirates earlier, and I know you were involved with the Pirates of the Caribbean, an update that was done, I believe, in the 1990s. So what was it like to get to work on that after being such a fan?
It was tremendous stress because it was the so-called politically correct Pirates of the Caribbean. It's where we changed the chase scene, where pirates were chasing women. And I got to be honest with you, the reason we were doing the project in the first place is because they had closed World of Motion in Epcot, and they had all of these figures available, which were created from original pirate molds. So they were the perfect scale and the perfect caricature. And so we just redesigned some of the vignettes to show them. We always thought that the chase scene was the weakest scene, because it was just some static pirates going around on turntables. Well, it turned out to be this politically correct thing that hit the media, and it really got blown out of proportion. But, you know, it was kind of stressful for me, but at the same time, it was an honor and a privilege to be working on this project that was so near and dear to Walt. And one thing I really loved doing, which is no longer there, but we were able to add a bookend scene to the Pirates, where the Pirates are trying to get the treasure out of the ammunition cache before it blew up. That's since been replaced by Johnny Depp.
Right, which, I understand why, but that's too bad, because that was a neat way to change the scene. Yeah, it's interesting with the politically correct changes, just because you've seen it again with the redhead scene, and I completely understand why changes are made. And I am not somebody that's going to like get out the pitchforks or whatever, for a change. I totally get it. But I'm sure that had to be kind of change the nature of the update for you when that kind of came out and became such an issue.
I have always maintained that change is okay if you make it better. And I honestly thought that getting rid of the turntables and doing some vignettes with better animated pirates was making the scene better. And I really felt that the finale with the two pirates trying to take the treasure out was certainly better than what it was before. I don't know that I have a strong opinion about the auction scene. I mean, I think they've done a nice job with it. Had that been the original scene, it probably would have been okay, but I think it really ruffled some feathers.
I think, like you said, the animatronics look great, and that's what the most important thing is that the ride still looks high quality. And that's what's amazed me. They've done so well through your update and down the road with like Pirates and Haunted Mansion and some, is they still look so new and classic. And I know you worked on an update to Haunted Mansion too. Is it fun to go in and kind of deal again with another classic attraction?
It's somewhat stressful for me because I really idolized the park, the way it was and the way Walt had designed it himself. And so I'm here. I am this kid fiddling with these things, but I really took it to heart and tried to do some of the best things I could with it. And I think one of those is probably Tarzan's treehouse. It was very, very difficult for me to tear out Swiss Family Robinson because I was such a fan of the film and the original treehouse, certainly the water wheel and all that. But it was one of those things where it was becoming irrelevant to the audience. And with the film Tarzan, when we saw that, it was so emotional and such a beautiful film that we thought, well, this actually will be the right thing to do. But I'll tell you what, it's just tough being the guy that goes in and tears these things out. It really puts the pressure to make something better.
Right, because I still appreciate, though, that, and I've heard the story about how it was close to being removed completely. I look at it as this saved a treehouse that has a lot of history, even if it's different.
And that's exactly what happened, because they would have torn it down.
Right. Beyond the challenge of just changing the treehouse, how tricky was it to find ways to incorporate Tarzan into kind of the similar spaces?
I thought it was really easy. We worked with the film guys. They talked about how they were inspired by Swiss Family Treehouse in the first place. It was a natural flow for the story, with the tiger scene and the heart-wrenching piece with the mother, with Nala. I think I have the right name. I'm not sure. Nala's Lion King, sorry. Kala. It was a long time ago.
Yeah, it's 20 years plus.
Anyway, we thought it fit really well, and it was kind of fun to reverse the flow. And that was another thing that we thought was an improvement, was with the suspension bridge and whatnot, it kind of gave Adventureland a bookend. And, it gave it an icon as you were walking through the land. So being able to walk up the one tree and across the bridge and go through the treehouse in a different flow, it was a simple thing to do, and it made a big difference. Yeah,
and that tree being now with the music playing from Tarzan and such, it kind of, like you mentioned, it anchors multiple lands where you're in one side of it, and you're like, oh, the tree's over there, and then the other side. So I think it succeeded, and I appreciate even the scenes itself with like the drawing and everything. Some of the effects you used really worked out well.
It's kind of fun because we weren't building it from scratch, and so we had a lot of added show and a lot of added lighting and audio and stuff, and we were debating about, do we bust the tree open and run all this conduit stuff through it, and I was just telling the guys, no, let's just drape it and we'll dress it out and it'll be like jungle vines. And so a lot of those that you see hanging through, weaving through the branches and stuff are actually electrical conduit and show control. And it saved a lot of work, to have to feed that all through the cement trunk and branches. I mean, that would have been a lot of work to do that. And I think it actually helped the look of it.
It doesn't look like, you don't look at that and say, oh, that looks exactly like the Swiss Family Treehouse with a few Tarzan things. Because there's the danger, people are just looking for that. But if it looks different and well done and with care like it does, I think it works out.
Well, and we must have done a good enough job, because it's one of the main things they added to Hong Kong for opening day. So that's very telling. I mean, that's the icon on the island, and well done there too.
Definitely. Speaking of kind of refreshes, I know you worked at Epcot and kind of came in and I believe worked with Rolly Crump on some updates for that. What was that like?
Well, Rolly, he's a hero, and it was such fun. I mean, he's a kick. He's everything you can imagine when you look at his artwork. And there's been a few Rolly Crump shows out around. Rolly is everything that you would hope he would be. He was a delight to work with. He's whimsical. He's fun. He's easygoing. And he, originally worked on the original Land Pavilion. And came back to the company for the renewals that were, the 10-year thing where they had to change sponsors. And so he was able to bring in a couple of his hot air balloons that he wanted to do the first time around, and some fun stuff. He was a ball to work with. It. Thoroughly enjoyed that project.
Yeah. So were you involved at all with some of the changes to the attractions, like Listen to the Land and Kitchen Cabaret that changed?
Yeah. Jim Steinmeier was Rolly's sidekick, who is a magician and a heck of a writer. And Jim created Food Rocks with Rennie Rao was the original stylist on the film, on the show. She also, I think, worked with Rolly and Jeff Burke on Kitchen Cabaret. But she came in and restyled the set. And Jim took all these contemporary songs and rewrote them and worked with the artists and rescored it. Did a magnificent job. I'm sorry that show isn't still there. I mean, I realized they had to add Soren, but it would have been nice to keep that show. I thought it was really fun. And they brought in Abby Holmes, who was a lighting designer for rock concert tours. So she was perfect for that show. They just let her go, and she did a magnificent job with that show. She brought it to life.
Yeah, I loved Food Rocks, and I agree. I like Soren a lot, and I know when they needed the queue space, I guess, but it feels weird when you walk in that pavilion, even though it's been a long time, and I'm like, this is where we're waiting in line, and this is where Food Rocks.
I think there would have been a way to save a show and still have a queue to another attraction.
Oh, I agree. Short-sighted, I guess. Also, too, with capacity, because as the parks grow and get more popular, shows like that, you might say, oh, it's just a secondary show. I wouldn't say that. But those shows are important for crowds to go to. It's sad.
Listen to the Land was fun because Rolly worked with Carl Hodges again, who was at, I think, Arizona. He was a horticulturist. And he came up with, new ways of producing agriculture and getting an environmental message across. And so we were able to fix that ride, bring it a little more up to date. That was a lot of fun. Had a lot of fun creating the rain.
That's a great scene because I'm so used to, I went on the original as a kid, but I'm so used to the one now. And given all the things like you mentioned, World of Motion, others that have left, having that boat ride still there and be so good, it seems better now because there aren't as many other things like it.
I'm very anxious to see what they do with Epcot. It definitely needs a big, big plus. It needs a lot of work. I'm curious whether they're going to keep the science factual thing or not. I'm supporting them and really looking forward to seeing what they do.
When I was a kid, Epcot was always my favorite park. And again, going in the 80s and 90s. And part of me, I'm really excited they're doing so many things. Like for a while, they didn't do anything there. They just kind of let it go. I'm a little nervous with some things. Like I'm still trying to wrap my brain around like Guardians of the Galaxy being there and such, but we'll see. It's a giant building. We'll see what they do with it.
Yeah, I'm keeping an open mind on that stuff.
Me too. I'm trying really hard. So I'll be excited to go and see everything. I know you did so many things at Disney and eventually moved on to other projects. And I wanted to ask you about a few of the other projects, if that's okay.
Sure.
Most of these I haven't been to, but I've read about them and I'm very curious. So one of them is the Six Flags power plant in Baltimore.
I loved it.
So tell me about that.
Well, that was one of the first ones that Gary Goddard and his group got to do, and it was a way we could play with Jules Verne a little bit. It was an interesting project and a little bit frustrating because Six Flags did not want any rides. And Gary in particular, Gary's a theme park guy too. We all were. And we're like, oh, you got to have something in here. We Eddie Martinez had designed some roller coasters, and there was some different stuff. And all they wanted were shows. They were trying to get a different thing for, because they were known as the roller coaster parks. And it turned out that their strategy, Six Flags strategy, was not very good because that park closed about a year or two later. But it was a lot of fun to work on. It was an art director's dream.
Yeah, it's too bad because I feel like if they could have maybe if they could have done a few rides and balanced it out, it would have worked. Or maybe it sounds like something that might work today with all the themed restaurants and different things you have.
Well, and I think you're going to see stuff like that because of the malls. And malls are really struggling with retail dying, basically. They're going to have to figure out some kind of a live, work, play situation and what to do with the malls. And that's going to bring in some entertainment. I know that there are groups out there that are addressing that right now. So we might be seeing that kind of thing.
Well, it would be exciting for me because I feel like, I love going to, Disney and Universal and whatnot, but having kind of self-contained little, I wouldn't even say little, but self-contained parks that are themed well and that people that have worked on theme parks like yourself and others can do, it seems like it would be a lot of fun in, different cities like people can go to in their own towns and such.
Yeah, very regional based.
Right. And I know you also worked on another attraction, the Monster Mansion.
Yeah, that was a ball.
Six Flags does not do that many dark rides anymore, especially my local St. Louis park. We only have one. So it's fun to see something crazy, kind of crazy like that.
Well, and the honor for me is that I got to work on that one twice. I got to work on Hershey twice, and I got to work on Busch Gardens, Enchanted Lab facility twice. That's very rare. And they were all with Gary Goddard. Gary did Monster Plantation, which ironically was a replacement for the Tales of Okefenokee, which is very much like Splash Mountain. It was Brer Rabbit and Brer Fox. And basically our Monster Mansion was a refresh. We went in and rehabbed it and added a lot of fun effects and different things. It's very popular.
So what's it like when you've already, I already asked you earlier about kind of refreshing classics, but what about one you've worked on? What is it like to go in and are you trying to fix
it's funny
things?
To go in and you tear out your own sets. That's really weird. History is most things that anybody works on get changed by somebody. It's rare that you change it yourself. I'm not sure. I would have to say that Enchanted Lab at Busch Gardens was a much better show than Secrets of Castle O'Sullivan. We always thought Enchanted Lab was one of the greatest theme park shows done, but they wanted to change to Ireland, and so we were involved with converting the entire land, and so we rewrote a show that was basically the same kind of magic show with live actors and effects for the same theater. And then the other one, of course, was the Chocolate Factory, which we had worked on 2 or 3, and it's just gone through another generation of it. So the Hershey's Chocolate World Chocolate Tour has changed several times over the years, and 2 of those generations were something I was involved with.
Yeah, that's interesting. I have not been there, but I've seen that attraction. I've watched, I guess, the video that was not the latest version because it's getting changed. But that's such an, I mean, I'm not going to say odd in a bad way. It's such a unique attraction. I love the fact that they're doing something that's kind of commercial based with Hershey, but also has all those kind of classic dark ride elements to it.
Well, it's all about the fact that they could no longer bring guests through the real factory. In fact, I believe the factory's gone by now. But when Chocolate World opened, it was a visitor center because they needed to sell products and they could not bring people with health codes through the factory. So they created an artificial factory tour, and it was very sterile. It was a fun little ride, but just nothing really interesting to look at. And so the second generation that we worked on was built around the song "It's the Milk Chocolate," which is what Milton Hershey's story was. And it had the three little cows and the whole fun song, and it got to be very popular. And it's since changed. I haven't been on the update, but I hear it's okay.
It's cool. I love the fact that there are dark rides like that are completely their own thing. And like you said, were kind of created out of a necessity that they didn't expect they needed and have kind of morphed into something else. It's really, it's got to be fun to work on things like that.
Yeah, it is. I've been so lucky, and I've been doing it a long time too.
Yeah. So if it's okay, I wanted to ask you briefly, I know you had tried to create the Whirligig Woods project in North Carolina, and it sounded like a really cool project, and it sounds like it's not going forward, but I would love, if you're okay, I'd love to hear about it.
Sure. It did not happen because of the investors. I had a couple of bad business partners. It wasn't going to happen to the level that it really needed to be. I was going for a certain quality, albeit very small scale. And I grew up at a little park called Frontier Village in San Jose, and it was very charming, and it was a 40-acre park, and it was a beautiful little kind of a little Western park, had a train ride and whatnot. And so it was a great childhood having, building tree houses and haunted houses and train rides and stuff in my backyard. And I just wanted to create that experience for another generation. So that's what Whirligig Woods was going to be. It had the added value of a treehouse resort that was in the middle of the park. So essentially my castle would have been the tree houses, and they were all themed. They all had different themes. One was haunted, and one was fantasy, and one was kind of adventure-like. And you would take if you had reserved a tree house for the night, you would get on the railroad and you would go around, take the tour around the park and get out at your own private depot and be escorted to your treehouse. And then you had full run of the park that day and the next day. Well, the investors didn't come through, and I just decided rather than to do a half-baked job, I was just going to pull the plug on the project. And I've since figured out a different way to get my stories across. So I'm working on that right now.
Well, it's too bad that it didn't work out because, I read up on a lot of the articles that came out when you were planning it, and it just sounded so exciting. And like I mentioned earlier, I love the idea. I think you described it as a boutique park that can work regionally. And I don't mean that as a negative. I mean that as a positive and really uplift the kind of the culture of the area.
Right. It was specifically for the Triad and the Triangle of North Carolina, who they desperately need a quality family experience. And it was targeting the younger crowd. This wasn't going to have rock concerts at night and big giant roller coasters. This was kind of honoring the trees and the land that I have found, and very intimate, very, very sweet and quiet and kind of sincere. It's just a nice little park, and it's beautiful land, and I still have it. And I'm not going to turn it into a public thing, but I'm going to kind of create my own little artist retreat here, which will be studios for writing and drawing and painting and stuff, and invite some folks in that want to spend some time here, and we'll make it a magical little place.
Well, that sounds great too. I'm glad you found a way to use, because I know that it's a really attractive area. Just describing, tree houses and all that, but that you were going to do, but just the land itself, that you found another way to use it to a positive way.
Well, it's going to be a private thing rather than a public thing, and I think that's also good for the local communities. There was some concern, although it wasn't very overwhelming. It was about 80 people that naturally were concerned about noise and traffic, like you would be, because this is very serene out here. It's very pastoral. And this land in particular used to be a dairy farm, but it's very magical. it's got a lot of springs and little beautiful water things. And so that's where I was going to landscape it and make it a very nice place, a very nice experience for picnics and barbecues and birthday parties and stuff like that. Well, we'll do that on a private level.
Sure. No, that sounds great. So I'm curious, beyond just this park, I mean, we don't see overall, I mean, a lot of new parks, independent parks being built in the United States. It just seems to be a real challenge. What do you think is money, beyond money? Like, what are the big hurdles you think for parks like that to open, and maybe are we going to see change down the road?
Well, I think everybody's focused on China, certainly, and Indonesia, quite a bit in Dubai, Abu Dhabi. There's a lot of hope in South America. So the big companies, the big money is going international. There are local groups, and I was involved with some of them. They're local media outlets and developers and stuff that are interested in creating the kind of thing that I was talking about doing. So I suspect somewhere, sometime, we'll do that kind of thing in North Carolina and perhaps somewhere else. It'll be very small scale. The market's very saturated. You won't see any big Disney World resorts or anything like that. There'll be little things like I was trying to do.
You know, and that makes sense because you do see so much of even Disney, Shanghai, and then, Universal's putting one in Beijing and et cetera. There's just so much like that happening right now. But it makes sense because those are growth markets and we're kind of in a mature market here in the United States. But that's not totally bad because there's still a lot of investment happening in some of the bigger parks right now going on from, like we mentioned, with Star Wars and whatnot. But I wanted to ask you too, just in general about your career. And we've talked about a lot of projects you worked on, but what's kind of a favorite project maybe that we haven't discussed yet that you really enjoyed doing?
Great question. But I mean, I'd have to say my ultimate favorite was Disneyland Paris. I mean, that was a pinnacle. Gee.
It's okay. I didn't mean to put you on the spot.
No, it's hard to say because I feel like I've been able to be involved in so many great things. What I'm more focused on is the next thing I'm doing, and so I get very passionate about that. For instance, when Whirligig Woods went down and I pulled the plug on it, I've converted more to writing some books and creating a little mythology of some of the stories that were going to be told in the park. And it's a different way to get that story out and kind of inspire another generation. That's where my next focus is, writing these books, doing these pieces of art and these models, and we'll get a website, maybe some YouTube stuff going, and people will be able to experience it in a different way.
Well, that sounds amazing. And I'm looking forward to seeing what you do next. And if any of my listeners want to learn more about your work you're doing online, is there a good place to go?
Well, they can go to bobbaranick.com, and there's a website on there, and they can reach me. I love to talk to people. I spend a lot of time with students and encouraging them and finding what their true passion and their skills are. And, I feel privileged to have worked so hard to do what I wanted to do and achieve it and get to be a part of these things. And I want another generation to have that same success.
Well, excellent. This has been awesome. Just speaking of, you have so many good stories and it looks like you've worked on so many cool things. So I really appreciate the time and that you came and talked to me.
Thank you, Dan. It's been a joy.
Well, that was great to get a chance to talk with Bob. And if you enjoyed this episode, I'd recommend that you check out my conversations with Greg Meter, Peggy Ferris, and Rick Harper, all about their time working at the Disney Company on some great attractions. You can find all those at tomorrowsociety.com. If you'd like to support the show, there are a few great ways. You can leave a rating or review through Apple Podcast or your favorite podcast provider, and you can become a member of the Tomorrow Society at patreon.com/Tomorrow Society. If you'd like to connect with me, you can send me an email, dan@tomorrowsociety.com, or you can follow me on Twitter at TomorrowSOC or Facebook or Instagram at Tomorrow Society. The Tomorrow Society podcast is hosted, produced, and edited by Dan Heaton. The music was written by Adam Hookey and performed by the Sophisticated Babies. Next time, I will be talking with Courtney Guth and Emily McDermott from the Book of the Mouse Club podcast. We talk about how their podcast got started and go into some of their favorite Disney books. They do a really cool podcast with interviews with authors and some really great conversations between the two of them about books on Disney history and the company's films. You should definitely check out this show. Thank you so much for listening. I will talk to you again very soon.